Before the name Eve was ever spoken, before the garden had witnessed a single act of disobedience, there was another. A woman shaped from the same dust, breathing the same divine breath, standing in the same primordial light. And then, without warning, gone. Not from history, but from the pages meant to record it. For thousands of years, her name was whispered only in darkened rooms, inscribed on clay bowls buried beneath the floors of ancient homes, carved into amulets worn by mothers terrified of the night. Her name was Lilith. And the fact that you were never taught about her is not an accident. Somewhere between the first chapter of Genesis and the second, there is a silence. A gap so precise, so deliberate, that generations of scholars have either ignored it or explained it away. But the ancient world did not ignore it. The rabbis who copied the Torah by hand, letter by letter, knew something was missing. The scribes who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls knew. The Sumerian priests who recorded the deeds of beings they called gods knew. Across Babylon, across Assyria, across the mountain temples of a civilization older than any name we have given it, the same figure appeared, a woman of terrible beauty, of sovereign will, of knowledge that predated the law. She did not vanish, and the children she left behind reshaped the world in ways the earth has never fully recovered from. What you are about to enter is not mythology. It is not folklore dressed in theological language to frighten the faithful. It is an investigation built from Scripture, from ancient manuscripts, from the fragments of texts so dangerous they were excluded from the canon entirely, into one of the most buried questions in the history of religion. Who was the first woman? What happened when she refused to submit? Where did she go when she left Eden? And is it possible, is it even conceivable, that the catastrophe described in Genesis 6, the one that forced God himself to press a cosmic reset on all of creation, traces its roots back to her? The answers exist. They have always existed, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look. There is a number that should stop you cold, not because it is enormous, but because of what it represents. For roughly 17 centuries, the official teaching of the Church, East and West, Catholic and Orthodox alike, held that the Bible contained one creation account, one first woman, and one beginning. 17 centuries of councils, of creeds, of carefully copied manuscripts, all constructed around a version of Genesis that most people still accept today without a single question. But here is what those 17 centuries never explained. Why does Genesis contain two separate and contradictory accounts of how humanity was made? Why does chapter 1 say that God created male and female simultaneously, and chapter 2 say that woman was formed later, from the rib of a sleeping man? The Church called it poetry. Our scholars called it literary structure. But there were others, ancient others, who called it something far more unsettling. They called it evidence. The word used in Genesis 1 verse 27 is precise. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them, male and female, together, simultaneously. On the sixth day, alongside every beast of the field, There is no surgery here, no rib, no sleep, no second act of formation. The man and the woman arrive at the same moment, from the same source, with the same breath. And then, without explanation, without transition, Genesis 2 begins again. A new telling, a new woman, a woman built specifically from Adam's side, specifically designed as a companion, specifically placed in a subordinate creative sequence. Two women, two origins. One of them has a name the entire world knows. The other was almost completely erased from the record. Almost. The rabbinical tradition was not silent about this. The scholars who devoted their lives to the Torah, men who counted every letter, who debated every syllable, who believed that not a single stroke of the pen was accidental, saw the contradiction immediately, and they preserved an explanation. The text, known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, composed somewhere between the 7th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, but drawing on oral traditions far older, names her directly. Her name was Lilith. She was the first wife of Adam, formed just as he was formed. From the dust of the earth, equal in origin, equal in... The problem was not her creation. The problem was what she refused to accept after it. When Adam demanded that she lie beneath him during intimacy, Lilith refused. Her argument, as recorded, was theological and precise. They were made from the same material, by the same hand, at the same moment. She would not be placed below what she considered her equal. Adam disagreed, and so Lilith did something no figure in the early chapters of Genesis does voluntarily. She left. She spoke the ineffable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, the name so holy that observant Jews do not pronounce it aloud even today. And she rose into the air and departed Eden. Gone. The garden continued. Adam remained. And God, according to the text, sent 3 angels after her, Senoi, Sansonoi, and Samangeloth. Their mission was to bring her back. She refused. She had already reached the Red Sea, at a region described in ancient cosmology as a wilderness between worlds, a liminal space at the edge of creation. The angels delivered an ultimatum: return, or 100 of your children will die each day. Lilith's response tells you everything about who or what she was understood to be. She accepted the terms without mourning. She did not weep. She did not beg. She acknowledged the cost and paid it, choosing exile over submission with the cold clarity of something that had never been fully tamed. That is not the behavior of a folktale villain. That is the behavior of a being with agency, with theology, with a cosmological role that someone at some point decided was far too dangerous to leave in the primary text. Now, hold that image for a moment. A woman who knew the name of God, who used it without fear, or who negotiated with divine messengers as an equal, and who walked away from paradise on her own terms. Ask yourself, why would that story need to be buried? Why would 17 centuries of institutional religion work so hard to reduce her to a footnote, a superstition, a name painted on clay bowls to frighten new mothers? The answer is not that she was unimportant. The answer is precisely the opposite. The traditions that preserved her name, Babylonian demonology, Sumerian temple records, Isaiah 34 verse 14, where the Hebrew word Lilith appears in the canonical Bible itself as a creature of desolation, did not invent her. They remembered her. There is a fundamental difference between invention and memory, and ancient scribes understood that difference better than we ever have. Isaiah 34 is a chapter of divine judgment against the nations, a prophecy of desolation so total that the land becomes permanently uninhabitable. Verse 14 reads, in most modern translations, something like, wildcats shall meet with hyenas, or screech owls in the wilderness. But the Hebrew word underneath those sanitized translations is unmistakable. It is Lilith, a night creature, a feminine singular noun, appearing in the middle of a passage about cosmic destruction, about the uncreation of a corrupted world, surrounded by demons and wild spirits wandering through a land God has surrendered to chaos. The translators who rendered it as screech owl were not being careless. They were being deliberate, careful to ensure that a single canonical reference to the most dangerous woman in the ancient world remained invisible to the average reader. But it is there. It has always been there, embedded in the oldest manuscripts, surviving every revision, every council, every editorial hand that passed over the text. This is the foundation on which everything else in this investigation rests. Before we can understand the Nephilim, before we can understand the Watchers, before we can understand why God looked at a world he had called good and decided to drown it entirely, we have to understand that the erasure of Lilith was not a theological accident. It was a deliberate act, a redaction, a choice made by someone who understood exactly what her story implied, and who understood that if the full picture were preserved, the questions it raised would be impossible to contain. Because Lilith's story does not end with her departure from Eden. It does not end at the Red Sea, or in her negotiation with 3 angels, or even in her reduction to a demon of infant death in medieval folklore. Her story, if the ancient sources are to be believed, intersects with the most catastrophic chapter in the entire biblical narrative, the one that ends with every living thing on earth submerged and dead beneath water. And that intersection is not coincidental, it is causal. Guard that thought carefully, because what comes next will make it impossible to see Genesis the way you saw it before. Open a Bible to the very first page. Read slowly. Read carefully. By the time you reach the end of Genesis 1, God has created light, sky, land, sea, plants, stars, animals, and finally, on the 6th day, humanity, male and female, together in one act, in one verse. God looks at everything he has made and calls it very good. Then chapter 1 ends, and then something strange happens. Genesis 2 does not continue the story. It starts it over. A new garden, a new forming of man from dust, a new loneliness, a new solution, a new woman, built not from dust, but from living bone. 2 accounts, same book, same opening chapters, and the contradiction between them is so precise, so structural, that it cannot be dismissed as accident or poetic license. Something is being concealed in the space between those 2 chapters, and the ancient world knew exactly what it was. Scholars have wrestled with this for centuries and produced a tidy answer. The 2 accounts are simply different literary traditions stitched together by a later editor, reflecting the theology of 2 distinct ancient communities. The first account, they say, is from a source called the priestly tradition, formal, structured, concerned with cosmic order. The second is from a source called the Yahwist tradition, intimate, earthy, anthropological. Interesting theory, academically defensible. But here is the problem with that explanation. It tells you how the text was assembled, not what was lost in the assembly. Because the rabbinical scholars who lived closest to the original oral tradition, the men of the Talmudic academies, the mystics of the early Kabbalistic schools, did not see a literary scene. They saw a deleted chapter. They saw a first woman who existed before Eve, who was formed in chapter 1 and then disappeared before chapter 2 began, and whose removal from the official text left behind a contradiction that no amount of literary theory has ever fully resolved. The document that preserved her story most completely is called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. It is a medieval text, yes, but medieval texts do not generate traditions from nothing. They record what was already being whispered, and what the Alphabet of Ben Sira recorded was this: Lilith was created simultaneously with Adam, from the same earth, animated by the same breath. She was not a secondary creation. She was not a derivative. She was a first, and she understood herself as such. When conflict arose between her and Adam over the question of dominance and submission, a conflict theological in not merely domestic, she did not surrender her position. She invoked the name of God and departed. And the text is explicit that this was not a fall, not a sin in the traditional sense, but an act of sovereign will by a being who had never been given a reason to accept subordination in the first place. That distinction matters enormously. Keep it in mind. Now look at what the Dead Sea Scrolls add to this picture. Found between the years 1947 and 1956 in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea, these manuscripts, some of them more than 2,000 years old, include fragments of texts that were clearly part of the living religious conversation of their time. Among them is a document called the Songs of the Sage, or in Hebrew the Maskil Hymns, which contains an explicit reference to Lilith by name in the context of warding off demonic forces. She is not a metaphor here. She is not a symbol. She is treated as a real entity whose influence over human beings was considered a genuine and present danger. The community at Qumran, serious, ascetic, obsessively textual, included her in their liturgical protective prayers. These were not superstitious peasants. These were scholars who knew the Torah better than almost anyone alive today, and they took her seriously enough to pray against her by name. The Book of Jubilees adds another layer. Written sometime in the 2nd century before the Common Era and considered authoritative scripture by the community at Qumran, as well as by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to this day, the Book of Jubilees takes enormous care in its retelling of the early chapters of Genesis. It fills gaps. It names unnamed figures. It provides timelines, motivations, and cosmological context that the canonical text leaves deliberately vague. And in its treatment of the pre-flood era, the world between Eden and the waters, it describes a corruption so thorough, so systemic, that it reached into the very fabric of biological creation. Jubilees does not name Lilith explicitly in every passage, but the architecture it describes, rebellious spiritual beings, illicit unions, contaminated bloodlines, a world that had become something God never intended, fits her presence like a key, fits a lock. Something was already broken before the Watchers ever descended, and that something had a name. This is the moment to talk about the structure of the Hebrew text itself, because the original language reveals things that translation consistently buries. The Hebrew word for the creation of humanity in Genesis 1, verse 27, uses a verb form called the call perfect, a completed action, final and whole. But the Hebrew word used when Adam names his wife in Genesis 2, verse 23, is a different register entirely. It is intimate, relational, almost desperate in its specificity. Adam calls her Isha, woman, because she was taken from Ish, man. It is a declaration of origin, of derivation, of connection. When you understand that the first woman in chapter 1 was given no such derivation, no such connective naming, no such scene of introduction, she simply appeared and then vanished. The absence becomes thunderous. Genesis 2 reads like someone trying very hard to establish a new beginning, while hoping you will not ask what happened to the original one. And here is the question you should be sitting with right now. Why does it matter? Why does the existence of a first woman erased from the primary text have anything to do with the catastrophe of Genesis 6? With giants walking the earth, with angels abandoning heaven, with a flood that killed every breathing thing? The answer lies in what Lilith became after she left the garden, because the ancient sources do not describe her as simply disappearing into myth. They describe her as active, engaged, multiplying, building something in the wilderness between worlds that would eventually make contact with the other great rebellion in the biblical narrative, the descent of the Watchers. 2 acts of defiance, 2 ruptures in the cosmic order, and between them, a lineage that the Bible almost entirely refuses to discuss. The story written in the margins of Eden was not written there by accident. It was placed there by people who understood that some truths are too destabilizing to leave in the center of the page, but the margins are still part of the book, and the book is still open. Say her name in the right academic circle and watch the room divide. Some scholars will tell you she is a late invention, a medieval elaboration built on a single ambiguous Hebrew word in Isaiah. Others will lower their voices slightly and admit that the trail of evidence is older, wider, and stranger than most textbooks are willing to acknowledge. Because Lilith does not belong only to Jewish tradition. She does not originate in one culture, one climate, one theological system. She appears under different names, with eerily consistent characteristics across Babylon, Assyria, Sumer, ancient Persia, and even in fragmentary references from cultures that had no known contact with the Hebrew world. When the same figure surfaces independently across civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years, you're no longer dealing with mythology, you're dealing with memory. And the question stops being who invented her and starts being what did they all remember? The oldest trail leads to Mesopotamia. In ancient Sumerian and Babylonian religious cosmology, a class of beings existed that were neither fully divine nor fully human, liminal entities that inhabited the boundaries between the ordered world and the chaos beyond it. Among them was a figure called Lilith, sometimes written as Ardat Lili, a female wind spirit associated with disease, with the night, with the death of infants, and with a particular kind of seductive power that could destroy men from the inside out. The Lilith was not a minor superstition. She appeared in official temple incantations, in medical texts, in protective rituals commissioned by kings. Her image, a winged woman with taloned feet, flanked by owls, standing on the backs of lions, was carved into clay plaques that archaeologists have excavated from the ruins of cities that existed more than 4,000 years ago. That is not folklore. That is institutional religion taking a specific entity seriously enough to build a protective liturgy around her. Now, move forward several centuries and several hundred kilometers. In ancient Babylonian demonology, the figure evolved but retained her core identity. nocturnal, feminine, associated with wind and wilderness, hostile to newborns and pregnant women, sexually predatory toward sleeping men. The incantation bowls found throughout the ancient Near East, ceramic vessels inscribed with protective spells and buried face down beneath the floors of homes to trap demons, frequently name Lilith specifically. These bowls date from roughly the 3rd to the 7th century of the Common Era, and they were used by Jewish, Christian, and pagan households alike. Think about that for a moment. Communities from 3 distinct religious traditions, communities that disagreed on virtually every theological question that mattered, all agreed that Lilith was real enough to warrant the same physical protective ritual. That kind of cross-cultural consensus does not emerge from fiction. It emerges from shared experience of something that preceded all 3 traditions. Then there is Isaiah 34, verse 14. The canonical Bible, the text that survived every council, every revision, every political and religious editorial hand, preserved her name in a single verse, buried in a passage of apocalyptic desolation. The Hebrew word is Lilith. Most English translations render it as screech owl, night creature, or night bird. The King James Version, published in the year 1611, used the phrase screech owl. The New International Version says night creatures. The English Standard Version says night bird. Only a handful of translations, including the New Revised Standard Version, render it as Lilith directly. But every serious Hebrew scholar knows what the word is. It is a proper noun, disguised as a common one. It is a name that someone decided was safer presented as a species than as an individual. The fact that it survived at all, in any form, inside the canonical text, suggests that its erasure was never quite complete enough. Here's something that should genuinely disturb you. The characteristics assigned to Lilith across every culture that remembered her are not random. They are not the scattered projections of fearful imaginations reaching for different explanations of different anxieties. They are consistent across Babylon, across Assyria, across the Hebrew tradition, across Persian Zoroastrian texts that describe a demoness called Jahi who corrupts the righteous through seduction. The same profile emerges: nocturnal, winged, sexually autonomous in a way that ancient patriarchal cultures found cosmically threatening, associated with the death of children, particularly newborns, connected to wilderness, to the spaces outside human civilization, to the liminal zones where divine order frays into chaos, possessing knowledge that should not belong to a created being. That last characteristic is the one that connects her most directly to what comes later in the biblical narrative. She knew the name of God. She used it. And the ancient world treated that kind of knowledge not as a gift, but as a weapon. The physical descriptions preserved in ancient art are equally consistent. The famous Burney relief, a Babylonian terracotta plaque dating to roughly 1950 before the Common Era, now housed in the British Museum, depicts a nude winged woman with taloned feet, holding a ring and rod of divine authority, flanked by owls, standing atop 2 lions. For decades, archaeologists debated whether this figure represented Lilith, Inanna, or Ishtar. The debate itself is revealing. Inanna and Ishtar were goddess figures, powerful, sovereign, transgressive, sexually dominant in ways that defied the patriarchal cosmological order. The fact that Lilith's iconography is indistinguishable from theirs is not a case of mistaken identity. It is a case of cultural memory preserving the same archetype across different naming systems. Yet whatever the ancient world was remembering, it remembered it with wings, with talons, with divine instruments in its hands, and with owls, the birds of night and forbidden knowledge, standing watch beside it. But here is where the portrait becomes something more than demonology, because Lilith, in the oldest and most complete versions of her story, is not simply a destroyer. She is a mother. The texts that describe her departure from Eden also describe what she did after leaving. She did not vanish into abstraction. She produced offspring, vast numbers of them by some accounts, beings called Lilin or Lilim, her children by demonic unions in the wilderness. And now, the question that has been building since the first chapter of this investigation arrives with full force. If Lilith left Eden before the events of Genesis 6, if she was already active in the world, already producing a lineage of hybrid beings in the spaces between the human and the divine, then what exactly were the Watchers descending into when they left heaven and took human women? Was the corruption of the earth that Genesis 6 describes the beginning of the story? Or was it the culmination of one that had started long before, with a woman standing at the shore of the Red Sea, accepting the death of 100 children per day, rather than return to a garden that had tried to make her small? That is not a rhetorical question. The answer is buried in the next piece of the record. And it is darker than anything the church ever wanted to discuss. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. 4 verses. That is all the canonical Bible devotes to one of the most explosive events in the entire biblical narrative. Read them slowly, because most people have passed over them their entire lives without understanding what they are actually saying. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, 4 verses. No explanation of who the sons of God were, no explanation of where they came from or why they acted. No description of what the Nephilim actually were or what they did. The text drops this information into the narrative like a stone into deep water, and then moves on to Noah as if nothing cosmically shattering had just been described, but something had. And the ancient world, the world that produced the texts the canon chose not to include, preserved the full account in extraordinary detail. The Book of Enoch is the single most important extra-biblical document for understanding Genesis 6. Attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, the man described in Genesis 5, verse 24, as someone who walked faithfully with God and then was no more, because God took him away. The Book of Enoch was not a fringe text in the ancient world. It was quoted directly by the New Testament letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15. It was considered scripture by the early church fathers Tertullian and Origen. It was preserved in its complete form only in Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has treated it as canonical scripture for more than 1,500 years. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran, among them were multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, more copies of Enoch than of most books that eventually made it into the canonical Bible. This was not a marginal curiosity. This was a central text that the later institutional church decided was too detailed, too specific, and too dangerous to leave in the hands of ordinary believers. What Enoch describes is this: a group of 200 divine beings called the Watchers, or in Hebrew, the Urim, which simply means those who watch, made a collective decision to descend to earth and take human women as wives. The text is explicit that this was a premeditated act. Their leader, a being named Semyaza, extracted an oath from all 200 of them before the descent, because he feared that if they proceeded, the others might lose courage and leave him to bear the punishment alone. 200 beings swearing a mutual oath of transgression on a mountain called Hermon. The name itself derives from the Hebrew word for curse or oath, before deliberately abandoning their assigned domain in the heavenly order. This was not a moment of weakness. It was not a temptation that caught them off guard. It was a conspiracy, a planned rebellion, an organized defection from the cosmic hierarchy, and its consequences did not stay contained. The Watchers brought things with them when they descended. The Book of Enoch catalogs these with unsettling specificity. A Watcher named Azazel taught human beings to make weapons of war, swords, shields, breastplates, and also taught women the art of beautification through cosmetics and jewelry, which the text frames not as vanity, but as a specific tool of seduction used to accelerate the corruption. A Watcher named Semyaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Others taught astrology, the reading of omens, the cutting of roots for medicine and poison, and, most significantly, the manipulation of knowledge about the structure of creation itself. These were not gifts. They were leverage. They were the instruments of a civilization being deliberately pushed beyond the boundaries God had set for it, handed advanced capabilities it had not earned and was not prepared to steward. Azazel, in particular, is described in terms that should make you pause. His teaching of metallurgy, of weapons specifically, is treated by Enoch as the primordial source of human violence, not a symptom of corruption, the cause of it. Now here is the connection that most treatments of the Watcher narrative never fully develop. When the Watchers descended, they did not descend into an empty world. They descended into a world that had already been touched by something that left Eden before them. Lilith had been active in the wilderness spaces, the same liminal zones where the Watchers chose to establish themselves for generations before Genesis 6. Her offspring, the Lilin, the children of her unions with demonic entities in the spaces outside the garden, were already present in the cosmological landscape that the Watchers entered. The ancient sources do not always draw this connection in a single direct line, but the architecture is there for anyone willing to read the texts in parallel. Two separate rebellions against the divine order, operating in the same geographic and spiritual territory, producing offspring whose existence represented the contamination of categories that God had created to be separate: the human and the divine, the mortal and the eternal, the dust and the fire. The Sumerian king lists, among the oldest written documents in human history, describe a period before the Great Flood in which kings ruled for impossibly long spans of time. Individual reigns lasting 800 years, 10,000 years, 36,000 years in some versions. Modern scholarship treats these as mythological exaggerations. But the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants, another Qumran text that expands on the Watcher narrative, describe the pre-flood world as one in which the hybrid offspring of the Watchers developed capabilities, lifespans, and physical dimensions that vastly exceeded anything within the human norm. If you are reading those two sets of documents side by side, the Sumerian king lists stop looking like exaggeration and start looking like a historical record written by people who were trying to describe something real using the only numerical framework they had. More than 200 flood narratives exist across cultures, separated by oceans and millennia. Nearly all of them describe a world before the flood populated by beings of extraordinary power and stature who became the cause of the catastrophe. That is not coincidence. That is the echo of a shared memory. And here is where the question of Lilith becomes truly unavoidable. The Hebrew phrase used in Genesis 6, verse 2, B'nai ha-Elohim, the sons of God, is the same phrase used in Job 1, verse 6, where it clearly refers to divine beings standing in the heavenly court. It is the same construction used in Psalm 82, where God judges among the divine beings for their failure to maintain justice on earth. These are not metaphors for righteous human men, as some later interpreters argued, to domesticate the text. They are what they say they are, celestial beings who crossed a boundary they were not permitted to cross. But the boundary had already been tested. Lilith had already demonstrated that created beings with divine knowledge could choose defiance over submission, exile over obedience, their own will over the order assigned to them. The Watchers did not invent rebellion. They inherited a world where rebellion had already carved out territory. They descended into a wound that was already open. And what they poured into that wound, their knowledge, their seed, their transgression, produced something that made God look at his creation and see not beauty, but an emergency. The word appears twice in the canonical Bible, and both times it lands like a stone dropped into silence. Nephilim. In Genesis 6, verse 4, they are introduced without ceremony, without definition, without any explanation of what they are or where exactly they came from. The text simply states that they were on the earth in those days and also afterward, as if their existence were a fact too obvious to require elaboration. The second appearance is in Numbers 13, verse 33, where the Israelite spies returning from Canaan report that they saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch, and that beside them they felt like grasshoppers. Two mentions, no biography, no origin story in the canonical text, and yet the ancient world built an entire cosmological framework around them, had described their deeds in terrifying detail, and remembered their existence as the central reason the earth was destroyed. Whatever the Nephilim were, they were not a footnote. They were the catastrophe. The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from the root nephal, which means to fall, the fallen ones. Some interpreters have used this etymology to argue that the term refers to fallen angels themselves rather than their offspring. But the grammar of Genesis 6 is explicit. The Nephilim were the children born of the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of humans. They were the product of the transgression, not the transgressors themselves. Other etymological readings suggest the word means those who cause others to fall, beings whose very existence produced moral and spiritual collapse in everyone around them. Both readings are true simultaneously, and the ancient sources understood this. The Nephilim were fallen in origin, descended from a rebellion against the divine order, and they were agents of falling engines of corruption whose appetites and abilities overwhelmed every social, moral, and spiritual structure the early human world had built. The Book of Enoch describes them in physical terms that are almost impossible to process against the background of what we consider normal human experience. Their height, in some manuscript traditions, reached 900 feet. Their appetites were insatiable. They consumed the food production of entire regions, then turned to livestock, then to human beings themselves. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserves fragments of their own voices, their own conversations, their own terrifying dreams, in which they began to sense that a judgment was coming for what they had become. They were not simply large, violent humans. They were beings caught between two natures, human enough to walk the earth, divine enough to possess knowledge and power that no purely human civilization could have generated independently. And the collision of those two natures produced something that was coherent in neither category. They belonged fully to neither world, and that displacement made them dangerous in a way that pure evil never quite achieves, because pure evil can be recognized and resisted. What the Nephilim represented was something more subtle, a contamination of the categories themselves. Now think about what this means in the context of Lilith. If the Lilin, her offspring from her unions in the wilderness, were already present in the world before the Watchers descended, then the Nephilim were not born into a spiritually neutral environment. They were born into a world that had already been seeded with hybrid beings of a different kind. The Lilin were not physical giants. The ancient sources describe them differently, as entities that operated in the liminal spaces, in dreams, in the thresholds between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. They were the corrupting influence in the invisible architecture of the world, just as the Nephilim were the corrupting influence in its visible, physical, political architecture. Together, if the ancient sources are read as a unified testimony rather than disconnected fragments, they represent a two-level contamination. Above the surface of human civilization, giants ruled by force. Beneath it, in the dream layer, in the spiritual substrate, entities of a different lineage operated by seduction and deception. Corruption from above and below simultaneously, and the human beings caught between those two pressures had no reference point for resistance. The ancient world did not remember the Nephilim only with horror. That is the part that the standard religious retelling consistently omits, and it is the part that explains the most about what Genesis 6 is actually describing. The Nephilim were also worshipped. Their hybrid, part divine, part human, made them candidates for the kind of reverence that early human societies directed toward beings that seemed to bridge the gap between the mortal world and the eternal one. The Sumerian tradition of divine kingship, in which the legitimacy of a ruler derived from a divine bloodline, a literal descent from the gods, maps almost perfectly onto a world in which beings of mixed divine and human origin walked among ordinary humans and exercised power that ordinary humans could not match or explain. The Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh describes its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid king of extraordinary strength, knowledge, and longevity, who built the walls of Uruk and sought the secret of immortality. If you are reading the Book of Enoch alongside that text, Gilgamesh stops looking like mythology and starts looking like a portrait drawn from life. Here is what the Book of Enoch says happened as the Nephilim multiplied. The earth could not sustain them. Their consumption was not merely physical, it was existential. They devoured resources, they devoured people, They devoured the spiritual integrity of a world that had been designed for a different kind of inhabitant. The cry of the earth itself rose to heaven. That is the specific language the text uses. The earth cried out. Not just humanity. The earth, the created order, the fabric of the world God had constructed and called good, registered the presence of the Nephilim as a wound that was actively getting worse. 4 archangels standing before the throne of God brought the report. The earth is crying from the voice of their cries up to the gates of heaven. And God listened. What followed was not impulsive. It was not disproportionate. It was a response to a specific biological, spiritual, and cosmological emergency that had been building since the moment Lilith walked out of Eden, and the first boundary between what was permitted and what was forbidden was tested by a created being with the knowledge and a will to cross it. And here is the thread that connects everything in this investigation into a single, coherent picture that is far more disturbing than any of its individual parts. Lilith left Eden with the name of God in her mouth and the refusal of submission in her bones. The Watchers descended with premeditated intention and 200 sworn oaths of transgression. The Nephilim were born at the intersection of those 2 rebellions, physical embodiments of a world that had been systematically unmade from 2 directions at once. They were the proof that the wound was real. They were the evidence that the contamination had reached into the living tissue of creation itself. When God looked at the earth in Genesis 6, verse 5, and saw that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. That word, only, is the word that should arrest you completely. Not mostly, not frequently, only, always, continuously. That is not a description of moral weakness. That is a description of a species that had been restructured at a level deeper than behavior. The blood of 2 worlds had mixed, and what it produced had made the original design unrecognizable. Genesis 6, verse 5. Read it the way it was meant to be read, not as a preamble to a children's story about animals on a boat, but as a divine autopsy report on a civilization. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Every inclination, only evil, all the time. This is not a description of a society that had drifted morally, that had become greedy or violent in the ways that ordinary human societies become greedy and violent. This is a description of something that had been fundamentally altered at the level of its inner architecture. The word used in the original Hebrew for inclination is yetzer, the same word used in rabbinic theology to describe the deep impulse that drives human behavior from the inside. When the text says that every yetzer was only evil continuously, it is saying that the default orientation of the human heart had been permanently inverted, not corrupted, inverted. That does not happen through bad choices alone. That happens when the other thing has been changed. Imagine the world in those final years before the flood. Not the sanitized Sunday school version, a gentle rain that rose slowly while one righteous family floated peacefully above it. The world the ancient sources describe was a civilization of staggering complexity and staggering horror existing simultaneously. Cities that the Book of Enoch tells us had been built with knowledge the Watchers transmitted, metallurgy, architecture, astronomical calculation, the manipulation of natural forces that ordinary human development would not have reached for thousands of years more. A ruling class of Nephilim, massive, long-lived hybrid beings who commanded resources, armies, and reverence in equal measure, presiding over a human population that had been systematically reduced to something between subjects and livestock. Temple systems built around the worship of beings who were not God, in which the vertical line between the human and the divine had been so thoroughly blurred that the concept of genuine worship had become incoherent. And beneath all of it, in the invisible substrate of the world, are the influence of Lilith's lineage, operating in the dream layer, in the spiritual nervous system of a civilization that had lost its ability to distinguish between the voice of God and the voice of everything that opposed him. Genesis 6, verse 11, uses a specific Hebrew word to describe the condition of the earth before the flood, shachat. It is translated as corrupt in most English versions, but shachat carries a meaning far more precise than moral failure. It means ruined, destroyed from within. The same word is used later in the Torah to describe meat that has gone bad, flesh that has decomposed past the point of salvage. When the text says the earth was shachat before God, it is not describing a society in need of reform. It is describing a biological and spiritual reality that had crossed a threshold of no return. And then verse 12 makes it even more specific. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. The Hebrew phrase for corrupted their ways is hishchit darko. They had ruined their path, not their behavior, their path. The trajectory of what they were had been fundamentally redirected away from what they were created to be. This is the diagnosis that precedes the flood. Not wickedness in the ordinary sense, ruin at the level of direction and design. Now consider Noah. Genesis 6, verse 9, describes him with a phrase that most translations render as righteous and blameless among the people of his time, a moral description. And Noah was morally righteous, the text affirms that. But the Hebrew phrase tamim in his generations, blameless in his generations, has a secondary meaning that rabbinical scholars and early church fathers both noted, and that modern translators have largely chosen to set aside. Tamim refers not only to moral integrity, but to wholeness, to completeness, to being without blemish or mixture. It is the same word used in Leviticus to describe the animals required for sacrifice, animals that had to be physically perfect, unblemished, unmixed. In there, when Genesis says Noah was tamim in his generations, it is saying something about his lineage. His bloodline had not been contaminated. In a world where the mixing of the human and the non-human had become so widespread that the yetzer of every heart had been permanently inverted, Noah represented the last uncontaminated thread of the original human design. The flood was not a punishment for bad behavior, it was a surgical extraction, one family, one intact lineage, preserved while everything that had become irreversibly shachat was removed. The mechanics of the flood described in Genesis 7 are worth sitting with in full detail, because the text is not vague about what happened. The fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Two sources, from below and from above, simultaneously. The ancient Hebrew cosmology understood the earth as containing vast reservoirs of water beneath the surface, the tehom, the deep, held in place by God's creative act since Genesis 1, and above the sky, a firmament of water held back by the same divine ordering. When both were released at once, this was not a storm. This was the deliberate uncreation of the protective structure God had built into the cosmos on the second day of creation. He was not sending rain. He was withdrawing the architecture that kept the chaos at bay. He was allowing the world to return, temporarily, to the formless and empty state, the tohu wabohu of Genesis 1, verse 2, that preceded the creation of everything the Watchers and the Nephilim had corrupted. The flood was a controlled demolition of a world that could not be repaired. It was the most precise possible act of cosmic surgery, performed at the largest possible scale. And what of Lilith in all of this? The ancient sources are silent in a specific way, the silence of deliberate omission rather than ignorance. The flood, as described, targeted the physical world, the flesh, the bloodlines, the biological contamination that had made every yetzer of every human heart point permanently away from God. But Lilith was never fully physical in the way the Nephilim were physical. She was the wind. She was the night. She was the entity who moved in the spaces between worlds, in the liminal zones that water could not reach. The incantation bowls used for centuries after the flood to ward off her influence, the medieval amulets bearing the names of the three angels who had pursued her, the consistent presence of her memory in cultures that emerged on the other side of every catastrophe, all of it points to the same conclusion. The flood cleansed the surface. It reset the biological architecture. It removed the Nephilim from the visible world. But the wound that Lilith had opened at the very beginning, the first act of defiance against the divine order, the first use of God's own name as a tool of self-liberation, that wound the water did not close, could not close, because the water was never designed for that. The flood was about flesh. What Lilith represented was something older, something that preceded flesh entirely, something that had been present in the space between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, long before the first human hand had ever touched the forbidden fruit. The reset was real. The reset was necessary. But it was not complete, and that incompleteness is precisely why what comes next in this story is the most important part of all. Noah stepped out of the ark onto a world scrubbed clean, and God set a rainbow in the sky as a covenant that the waters would never again destroy all life. It was a promise about method, not about threat. The threat had not been removed. The underlying fracture in the cosmic order, the one that began with a woman who knew God's name and chose exile over obedience, that fracture was still there quietly, beneath the new soil, beneath the new sky, beneath the silence of a world that had been emptied and refilled, but not yet fully healed. The ancient sources understood this. The rabbis understood this, and Jesus, standing in first century Jerusalem, all understood this when he looked at his disciples and told them that the days of the end would be exactly like the days of Noah. Not similar, exactly like. That word is the bridge between the world the flood erased and the world you are living in right now. Matthew 24, verse 37. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, and his disciples have asked him directly, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" He gives them a long answer full of wars, famines, earthquakes, and false prophets. And then, in the middle of all those signs, he says something that should reframe everything you have heard in this investigation, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man, not similar to, not reminiscent of, as it was. The Greek word used is hosper, exactly as, in precisely the same way. Jesus was not using Noah as a vague metaphor for moral decline. He was pointing to a specific set of conditions, a specific configuration of the world, and saying that configuration is coming back. If you want to understand what the end looks like, study what the beginning looked like. And if you have been paying attention to everything in this investigation, that statement is no longer abstract. It is a blueprint, and the blueprint is disturbingly familiar. Look at the world that existed before the flood and hold it next to the world that exists right now. Before the flood, the Watchers introduced technologies and knowledge that human civilization was not ready to steward: metallurgy, astronomical manipulation, the engineering of weapons, and most critically, the manipulation of biological boundaries between species. In the year 2012, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to researchers who developed techniques for editing the human genome. In the year 2020, that same Nobel Prize went to the developers of CRISPR-Cas9, a technology that allows scientists to cut, rewrite, and insert genetic sequences with a precision previously unimaginable. As of today, laboratories around the world are actively engaged in the creation of human-animal chimeras for medical research, in the editing of germline DNA, meaning changes that will be inherited by future generations, and in the development of synthetic biology that creates organisms that have never existed in any natural form. The Watchers taught humanity to manipulate the boundaries of living things. We have rebuilt that capability from scratch, and we are moving faster with it than any previous generation ever has. The parallel does not stop at genetics. Before the flood, the ancient sources describe a spiritual environment in which the boundary between the human and the supernatural had become so thoroughly degraded that human beings could no longer reliably distinguish between the voice of God and the voices of everything competing with it. The Lilith operated in the dream layer, in the subconscious, in the invisible architecture of the inner world. Today, in the early decades of the 21st century, the fastest growing spiritual movements in the Western world are not Christianity or Islam or Judaism. They are practices explicitly designed to make contact with non-human intelligences: channeling, mediumship, the deliberate invocation of entities whose origin are never examined with the same rigor applied to any other significant decision in a person's life. The technology for this has also been scaled. Millions of people are not visiting a single oracle in a single temple. They are sitting alone with devices in their hands, algorithmically guided toward content that systematically dismantles their ability to hold a coherent spiritual framework. That is not incidental. In the architecture of the pre-flood world, the corruption of spiritual discernment was not a side effect of the Nephilim's presence. It was the precondition for it. Now consider the ruins. Because the world the flood erased did not disappear completely. It left evidence. The megaliths of Baalbek in Lebanon contain stone blocks, the largest of which weighs approximately 1,650 tons, that no modern engineering consensus can fully explain in terms of how they were quarried, transported, and placed with the precision they display. The pyramids of Giza, aligned to within fractions of a degree to true north, using methods that remain genuinely disputed among engineers, were built in a civilization that, according to the standard archaeological timeline, had only just invented writing. The underwater structures discovered off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, the megalithic complexes in Bolivia at Pumapunku, whose stones were cut with tolerances that suggest machine tooling, the ancient astronomical observatories in Turkey at Göbekli Tepe that predate agriculture by thousands of years. All of these exist in the historical record as anomalies, artifacts of a capability that should not have existed when it existed. The Book of Enoch said the watchers taught construction. The ruins say something was built. The gap between those two statements is narrower than the academic establishment is comfortable admitting. Here is the question that has been waiting at the center of this entire investigation, and now it is time to ask it plainly. If Lilith was the first act of rebellion, the first created being to choose sovereign defiance over assigned order, to use God's own name as a tool of self-liberation, to depart the divine design and build something in the wilderness that was never meant to exist, and if the Watchers were the second act, and if the Nephilim were the product of both acts converging in the physical world, and if the flood was the response to that convergence, then what are we to make of a world that is systematically recreating every condition that preceded it? Not accidentally, not unconsciously, with intent, with funding, all with institutional infrastructure, and with a cultural framework that has spent the last century methodically dismantling every theological and moral guardrail that was built in the aftermath of the flood, specifically to prevent the same thing from happening again. Is that a coincidence? Or is it the thing Jesus was pointing at when he said, "As it was in the days of Noah"? Lilith's story does not end with her exile. That is the final thing this investigation must make absolutely clear. The medieval church wanted her story to end there, safely contained in a category labeled superstition, reduced to a demon that frightened ignorant peasants, stripped of the theological weight that made her genuinely dangerous. But the ancient world knew better. The ancient world understood that what Lilith represented was not a personality. It was a principle. The principle that created beings with divine knowledge can choose to redirect that knowledge toward their own sovereignty, rather than toward the purpose for which it was given. That principle did not drown in the flood. It survived in the same way all principles survive, not in bodies, but in patterns, in the repeating architecture of a choice that has been made before and will be made again. Every generation since Noah has faced a version of the same question Lilith faced in the garden. Will you accept the order you were given, or will you speak the name of God and use it to build something of your own design? Most people never frame it in those terms. But that is the question underneath every other question in this investigation. The history recorded in these chapters was not preserved by accident. The Book of Enoch survived in Ethiopia when it was excluded everywhere else. The incantation bowl survived underground for 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived in clay jars and desert caves. Isaiah 34, verse 14, survived every translation committee that tried to bury it as a screech owl. These texts, these names, these records of what happened before the water came, they were kept. By whom and for what purpose is a question worth sitting with in silence. But this much the evidence makes clear. The story was not meant to be lost. It was meant to be found at a specific moment, by a specific generation, living in a specific kind of world, a world that looks, with increasing and uncomfortable precision, exactly like the one the water was sent to reset. The question is no longer whether the pattern is repeating. The only question that matters now, is what you are going to do with the fact that you can see it.